Well, I think most people can probably guess why, but we're running a couple minutes late, so without further ado, we're going to get started. Tonight we're going to...
Welcome to this stream on exploring penetration.
All right, let me turn me off. There we go. That's going to be terrible feedback right there, but all right. So thank you everyone for being here. I do apologize for things running a little bit behind schedule, but that's why we're going to get started. Tonight we're going to cover penetration testing, but before we get started, let's talk about why we're here in the first place, or why penetration testing is a career to begin with. Every 39 seconds on average, there's a cyber attack. And in recent days, that has only increased with the number of remote workers. Cyber attacks are increasing. 43% of those cyber attacks target small businesses. And the average cost of a data breach in 2020 is expected to exceed over $150 million. Now, over 3 million records are stolen in breaches every day. In fact, it's estimated 75% of everyone's healthcare records have already been stolen. Despite all the money that we continue to pour in to cyber defenses to stop these hacks. Now, one of the reasons this is, or you can surmise, is that we aren't quite thinking like the cyber criminals are. We need a mindset to be able to think how the criminals are going to think from a hacking perspective before they do, if we have any chance of defending against it. So that is going to be our topic tonight, is to talk about that. A little bit about myself. My name is, who is this Brandon guy anyway? My name is Brandon Keith. I'm the lead cybersecurity practice lead at Appalachia Technologies, and I help run a red team, or ethical hacking team, as well as other cybersecurity services that we offer. I have a master's in cybersecurity and information assurance from Western Governors University, and I'm also an adjunct professor at several universities, including University of Phoenix and Harrisburg University of Science and Technology, and I have various cybersecurity certifications. But all that aside, my main goal by sharing this information, what I love to do is to teach. I like to program in various languages such as Python, and I just enjoy hacking stuff. I like the mentality and figuring things out and solving real life problems by taking them apart and thinking about them in a different way. So on tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about what is penetration testing or ethical hacking. We hear about it a lot, and we're going to discuss exactly what that is, why it matters, and why it's even a career to begin with. So to start, what is a hacker? Well, the modern version of the word hacker, when we think about a hacker, you think about someone who is a criminal or cyber criminal. And that's not always how the word was used. Back in the day, someone who was a hacker was someone who was clever, someone who could take something apart, figure out how it works, and maybe use it for a different purpose. If you've ever heard anything about life hacking, where you take normal, ordinary, everyday objects, and then you take those things and use them in ways they weren't originally intended, that's the original idea of hacker. And the first hackers would take computer systems, figure out how they worked, and get them to work in ways they were never originally programmed or designed to work. That's the real meaning behind the term hacker. But we've gotten to a place from media and movies to a point where hacker is now considered a negative connotation. So how do we get away from this negative connotation? Well, we simply add the term ethical to it, or at least that's what we have done. So what is an ethical hacker? Because we can talk about ethics quite a bit and what ethics mean, but the real idea between what is ethical, at least in the context we're talking about, is someone who gains permission before attempting to hack into a computer system. We're not going to debate, the philosophy behind ethics and what's ethical and what laws are ethical or not ethical. We're just going to say, in general, if you have no malicious intent and you're not breaking any laws, then that's what we're considering ethical hacking. Now, that can get into a bit of a gray area if from an ethical standpoint or your principles and values, you don't believe in the laws of the country you live in, and that's okay. But for purposes of how we're discussing or talking about an ethical hacker here, that's what we mean when we say ethical hacker. It's someone with no malicious intent and who follows the laws. And the best way to describe it, if you think about a house that maybe you locked yourself out of, maybe you break into your own house. I know I've locked myself out of my own car before and had to break into my own car. And I didn't press charges against myself. I didn't go to jail for breaking into my own car. And that's the way we need to think about hacking. If we're trying to break into a device that's not ours, then we're committing a crime. If it's something we own and control, then the idea is then that's okay because we own that and we control that environment. So why would we study hacking? And I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but one of my favorite Chinese military generals said, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. That could not be more true when we're talking about cybersecurity. We continue to see defeat after defeat, breach after breach, and we have a lack of understanding of our enemy, which is the cyber criminals out there who use their intelligence and their ability to hack into things for nefarious purposes. Now, when we talk about penetration testing and the difference between penetration testing and ethical hacking, and you might hear these two terms interchangeably, a penetration test is a simulated cyber attack against a computer system and organization that uses an organized methodology. So the idea of conducting a penetration test means as organized. There is a method to the madness, so to speak. And you could almost call it is ethical hacking with clear objectives and goals. When someone is performing a penetration test against an organization, they're trying to penetrate those defenses and break through. And they're doing it in a methodical way. Now, for purposes of this presentation tonight, we're going to take company X, Y, and Z. This is going to be the generic company we're going to use, and we're going to walk through how, from a penetration testing perspective, you might conduct a penetration test against this company and how penetration testing works. So before we get started, I want to take a quick second to talk about another framework before we talk about the framework that I personally use and recommend for penetration testing. We'll talk about Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain. Now, Lockheed Martin created the cyber kill chain as a way of describing how adversaries break into systems. It's a very good chain. It starts with recon, figuring out who your enemy is and what you want to steal from your enemy. What's your target? Do they have medical information that they're looking to steal, personal information, credit card numbers, or maybe trade secrets? It starts out with a recon. Then it begins with weaponization. What is the best weapon to take out an enemy? Maybe that's through a phishing attack. Maybe it's through a malicious USB. And then delivery. What is the delivery mechanism? Is it via email? Is it via a hardware device? What are the ways you can deliver it? And then the exploitation part. You exploit the vulnerability or weakness in someone's system. Then you install your malware, or as we'll learn later, is really just malicious software. Then you create your command and control center that is going to help exfiltrate that data out of an organization. I've seen tests where people have actually been able to exfiltrate data out of an organization over FM radio frequencies. Try catching that in your firewall. It just won't happen. Lockheed Martin does a really good job of showing how a malicious actor goes through the process of how they hack into a system. But this doesn't work very well when we're conducting a penetration test. So the methodology that my team and I use, and the one that I like to adhere to, is called the Penetration Testing Execution Standard. Now, this standard came about a couple years ago because there was an issue in the industry where one company versus another company, both companies might be offering a penetration test, but the results of those penetration tests were very different. and there wasn't a good standard on how you conduct a penetration test and what were each of the phases for a penetration test. Hence, the penetration testing execution standard, born from a bunch of penetration testers and companies that came together, was born. Now, this standard hasn't been updated in quite a few years, but I think it still holds quite a bit of relevance in this field. And it's still important to look at, as the phases, even though technology has changed a little bit, still hold true. And these are the phases we're going to talk about tonight, from pre-engagement all the way to reporting when you're conducting a penetration test. So what do we do at the very beginning during the pre-engagement? Well, the first thing we need to do is create a scope of the engagement. When you're conducting a penetration test, what exactly are you testing for or testing against? What is your scenario? Is it an internal network penetration test? Is it someone from the outside who's going to attempt to use a phishing email to get into the company? Is it to see if someone can brute force some of your servers and potentially hack into the backups? All of these things are possible engagement and objectives for the engagement to test the validity of your defenses. Now, once you have clear objectives for what you want to do during your penetration test, you need to discuss what the rules are for your engagement. Now, remember, when you're hacking ethically, the idea is to stay within the confines of the law and not to get in trouble. So that means you need to have a set of rules. Think if you were asking someone to attempt to break into your house. Maybe your rule is that they can try and pick lock the door, but maybe one of the rules is don't break down the door or damage the door. Maybe those are rules that you set in place during the test. In the same way, when we're conducting a penetration test, we might put rules in place to prevent additional damage. I remember one engagement we were on, one of the rules we had is you need to be very careful with our environment. If you take down any of our systems at all during this engagement, we will end the engagement immediately. And that can be pretty difficult, because when you tend to hack into things and make things do things they weren't designed to do, it tends to cause disruption. So you have to figure out how to balance that with the organization you're conducting a penetration test on. And the better you get at that, the better a penetration tester or the better a company you'll have that conducts penetration tests. And then the last thing is you need to set a reward for the engagement. This stuff is pretty complicated, and in general, most people don't do this work for free. The current unemployment rating in cybersecurity is pretty low right now, near 0%. There is not enough people to do the jobs that is needed. In general, because of that, this field pays pretty well. Now, we'll talk about that near the end of the session, and what do the job prospects look like, and what are alternative jobs besides being a penetration tester? Because being a penetration tester is a very small part of cybersecurity. And while it's an interesting career, there are plenty of other excellent potential job opportunities for you in the cybersecurity field. So the first place we're going to start is intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. As we said before, we need to do some recon on the target that we had. So we have company XYZ. So what are some of the passive and active methods we can do against company XYZ? Well, we might perform this. We might do some dumpster diving. How many of you think that is a passive or active form of reconnaissance? Believe it or not, this is actually a passive form of reconnaissance. And the reason why this is passive is because,
Believe it or not, this is actually
because even though it is very possible for someone to potentially see you doing dumpster diving, it's not going to create direct logs on a system that a systems administrator or someone can look at. You can potentially steal these documents or get a hold of these documents without anyone realizing you're even there. So another great resource for when you're conducting penetration tests and you're trying to gather information on an organization is you might simply just look at job ads. You can find a lot of information just by looking at all the different ads that exist. For example, in the ad we have up here, we know that they're using WebEx, they're using HP desktops, specifically ThinkPads, and they're using Office 2010. Well, it's now 2020. Are there potential vulnerabilities in 2010 that could be taken advantage of in this organization? Oftentimes, just from looking at the job ads, we can quickly build an inventory of what a company's capabilities might be and what they have in place currently, and start to deduce what some of their vulnerabilities may be. Now, oftentimes, this becomes difficult because if you're trying to hire someone, how do you hire someone without asking for very specific qualifications? Now, another resource, if you've ever heard of it, is one called Elliott Advocacy. Now, what you can do with Elliott Advocacy is they collect information on CEO email addresses and phone numbers and customer service email addresses and phone numbers of several companies throughout the United States. They had this excellent idea of how often you need support or you need to contact directly the president of a company, or you want to state a grievance you have with the product and you couldn't get a hold of them. This gives all the emails and phone numbers of those people. Now, as a penetration tester, it's pretty clear to see that if you have a bunch of CEO emails, that this could be dangerous. This can potentially be a resource for finding contacts at a company if you're performing some kind of penetration test. Now remember, you want to be careful with this information, and you only want to do things in what would be considered an ethical manner, as we discussed before. Social media. Social media is another great way you can find all kinds of information out about a potential target. Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and even Twitch and TikTok might have important information on your targets, depending on if they have content on those systems. You can quickly see over the posts and the things that the company says publicly, you can get an idea of how that company has evolved over the years and what technology they might have. You might pick up information of who are important people at a company that may be good phishing targets when you start to get to that point in your penetration test. So another thing you can do is what's known as a Whois lookup. Now, when you use Whois, you're looking at all the data about a web domain. In this case, we're looking at brandonkeith.com, and you can see that I own that domain. You can see when I purchased it, when it was last updated, and that it was purchased through GoDaddy. You can also see the name servers of the website that's currently hosting it, or at least when this picture was taken, the website that was hosting my domain name. Whois is a great way to potentially get some information about any kind of domain or URL, and sometimes it's even used via threat hunting and by blue team members when they're trying to figure out when a certain domain tried to connect to their systems. So another great option, which is for passive recon, is Shodan.io. Now, this is a service that goes out and scans the internet every couple minutes and then creates a repository of all that information. In this case, we're looking at brandonkeith.com and all the saved information. So now I'm, again, passively collecting this information without ever even visiting the website. This makes it very easy for me through all of these different techniques to gather all kinds of information. And I didn't even have to create any logs on their servers that they can look at. Fumbling with my words a bit. Someone in the comments said, what if there is a lock on the dumpster? If there is a lock on the dumpster, then I would recommend not participating in dumpster diving unless part of your penetration test allows for some physical penetration testing, and maybe people on your team are allowed to attempt to pick the lock. That may be part of the penetration test. There are physical penetration tests that allow potentially trying to pick locks to get into systems. Great question. Now, another great resource is the Wayback Machine. Now, the Wayback Machine is an internet archive, and it constantly is taking snapshots of old websites. Here's one of Yahoo from the 1990s, and you can see the website looked a lot different than it does today. Using this, sometimes we can grab sensitive information that someone may have had on their website for long periods of time, and it may still be in the Wayback Machine, even though it's been deleted. Often it is services like this that is the reason why people will often say things like, once something goes on the internet, it never comes off the internet. Because this is not the only archiving tool on the internet. There's several different organizations that are constantly archiving different resources on the internet. Steve in the comments just said bolt cutters if determined. If you are allowed to use bolt cutters in your engagement, that would be fantastic, Steve, if that is allowed. But I imagine that would work very well. So what are some other reconnaissance tools we can potentially use? One tool that I like a lot is the Harvester. It's a command line tool, and it will start to aggregate things like Shodan, Whois, and other subdomains for you. Another great one is Recon-ng. We'll talk a little bit about Metasploit later, but if you like the way that Metasploit works and the way it's set up, Recon-ng is designed as a great web reconnaissance tool that's written to be very similar to how you use Metasploit Pro. And there are even a couple GUI interfaces for Recon-ng, so it may be a good option. Another one is Multigo, which is an interactive data mining tool. And the idea behind Multigo is that you can quickly figure out an organization's cloud infrastructure. Now, this may also be a good idea to use if you're a security professional at a company serving on the blue team. Maybe you want to use Multigo to figure out what kind of infrastructure do we have out there that I don't know exists? What do I have to defend that I may not know about? So some of these tools, as we'll see, can be used, even though they're used by penetration testers to find vulnerabilities in systems, they can also be used by organizations to help defend companies. So this is what the Harvester looks like. As you can see, it went through a couple different Google searches for brandonkeith.com. It's looking at the Shodan database, and then it will show a bunch of results out. In this case, there were not a lot of results for brandonkeith.com that you didn't already see via Shodan, but this is what the interface looks like. It's a command line interface. It has very specific switches that you would use like any other command line tool. So this is where Multigo shines, and you can see from here it's giving a very intuitive almost graphic of all the different devices it's finding on an organization. Now, one thing to be aware of is Multigo will not always give you accurate devices. It may think a device is related to an organization, but it might not be. If you're performing a penetration test and you're using Multigo, be sure to confirm the IP addresses and ranges with your client to make sure you know which range is truly a client's device. There's even been instances that's been shared on a couple different podcasts. The one I can remember most is from Darknet Diaries, where they talk about accidentally attacking the wrong company or the wrong IP addresses that were owned by a different company. Think about it this way. If you were paid to break into someone's house and they gave you permission to do it, and then you went and broke into someone else's house, the person's house you broke into would not care that you didn't mean to break into their house. It would still be wrong regardless. And that's just something we have to think about as hackers and how to do this responsibly when we're going through the penetration testing process. Because the last thing any of us wants to do is accidentally end up in jail or going through the legal system to try and get out of trouble because we made a simple mistake. And unfortunately, when we're looking at IP addresses, we only have to be off by one number to completely attack the wrong device or organization. So that was all the passive ways you can potentially gather information on a company. Now, there's other passive ways that we didn't mention. There is a multitude of ways you can get information on a organization. But after you've done all the passive reconnaissance, this is when you have to move into the active reconnaissance phase. This is where you start to use tools that are going to create traffic and logs for the system. So what are the things we do when we're performing active reconnaissance? Well, some of the things we might do include scanning or fingerprinting with different tools. We'll see how Nmap works in a minute and how that can quickly fingerprint a lot of devices on an organization. Another thing we can do is vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning is a very popular way of figuring out what your organization's attack surface looks like, because you can quickly find out via a vulnerability scanner such as Nessus or OpenVAS what are weaknesses or unpatched systems you might have in your environment. Now, another thing you can do is potentially traffic poisoning. You can potentially poison some traffic to gather some recon. Now, this is pretty active and borderline hacking when you start to poison traffic, but a lot of people might do this when you're testing Wi-Fi networks. You might poison traffic or become a man in the middle to start spying on traffic and doing additional recon. Maybe you don't do anything more than just poisoning that traffic, but this is where things get pretty interesting. Another reason a lot of people discuss or will say never use open Wi-Fi is because of the potential for poisoning that traffic, so that any potential cyber criminal or hacker that is looking at that Wi-Fi traffic can see the things you're sending via Wi-Fi. And the other thing we do via active reconnaissance, we start to do active enumeration. We figure out how many Windows devices, Linux devices, IoT devices might be on a network. All right, so one of my absolute favorite tools, and a tool I recommend, is Nmap. Now, Nmap is a de facto Swiss Army knife for penetration testing. And some of the things you can do in Nmap includes network ping sweeps. You can scan and enumerate ports and services, but it also has 500 plus scripts that allow you to perform certain ethical hacking functions. You can use Nmap, for example, to do some web app hacking, or you can use Nmap to check for certain vulnerabilities like Eternal Blue, and potentially run some additional test scripts to execute some code in that manner. Nmap's a very powerful tool, and it's often the go-to tool for many hackers. In fact, Nmap also seems to be the tool in the movies that everyone uses when they want to show that they're hacking. So here's an example of Nmap. We're going to run with the /A switch, and what this is going to do is going to do OS detection for us, and it's also going to enumerate and run standard or default scripts. Now, if we look at some of our results, we can see that we've already done some preliminary OS detection. We've detected some Microsoft ports that are open. We think this might be running Windows Server 2008. It might also be 7 or Vista. Nmap is not always 100% accurate on its device detection. We can also see we have some other sources that are open as well. On one of the other ones, we have a Tomcat server we can potentially take advantage of. And this is where, using Nmap, we can quickly start to develop a list of potential services and targets that we can use during our ethical hacking engagement. Now, network vulnerability scanners. We have quite a few different network vulnerability scanners that are on the market. One of them being, I included Nmap because there is a script to run with Nmap that will bring you back vulnerabilities. It's considered not quite as robust as using Tenable Nessus, Nexpos, or OpenVAS, but it can be used. Now, there used to be another network vulnerability scanner on the market. Unfortunately, they did go out of business or discontinued that product, so we won't discuss that here. But as you can see, the field for vulnerability scanners is not very large. There's not a lot out there in the industry. Between Nessus, Nexpos, and OpenVAS, they cover the majority of the vulnerability scanners that are used by organizations. And likely, if you're going to work, whether you're going to work as a penetration tester or you're going to work as a security analyst, you will likely come across one or all of these tools in your career. Now, if you don't like any of the tools we went over so far, there's a lot of options to create your own tools. Python is the de facto standard programming language that is often used for creating hacking tools. The reason Python is often used is because it is fast from a development perspective, not a speed perspective. For anyone that might program in C or Go, it's slower than those programming languages, but it's fast to develop. It has a lot of built-on libraries that lend it well to creating hacking tools. Scapy being a great example. This allows you to craft and forge your own network packets, similar to how you might use Nmap, but you can create your own custom network scanner, so to speak, using Scapy. Now, why would you do this? Well, you might have a very specific vulnerability, or maybe you're trying to create a scanner for a type of TCP/IP stack that's not standard to TCP/IP. There was a hacking challenge at the one point where I was going over with an acquaintance, and the idea to solve this hacking challenge, you had to find the hole that didn't exist in the normal TCP/IP stack. You had to custom code your own way of discovering the vulnerability and taking advantage of it. And current tools, maybe like Nmap, isn't really designed to do that. So maybe there's a custom solution you need to build to find the error you're looking for. Now, Requests is a great tool that allows you to mimic all kinds of HTTP requests. HTTP is the way all web pages on the internet communicate. By creating tools with that, you can create all kinds of great web app hacking tools that you can use. Now, Scrapy is another great Python library. If you've ever wanted to scrape something off of Craigslist or something that's posted either on Facebook or Twitter, Scrapy is a great library that allows you to run, automate, and build your own web spiders and scrape all kinds of information that might be valuable. Now, Man-in-the-Middle proxy is a command line proxy that can be used like Zap and Burp, which we'll cover later, that can be used for automating repetitive hacking tasks. This being said, with all of these different tools, it makes Python a really great way to start to dive in and build your own hacking tools. And another great advantage to this, especially if you're looking to move up in your career or move laterally into other positions, having hacking tools and a good GitHub on your repository of building those tools can be a huge resume booster. Now, once you've done all this recon, the next step we need to do is threat modeling and vulnerability analysis. What we're going to be trying to do is understanding, what did we find? How valuable is what we found? Is what we found a threat to our business or organization? Maybe we found credit card numbers. That's against PCI compliance if we're accepting credit cards. Well, I think leaking credit cards at all is just bad. And we know that that goes against compliance standards. That's a threat to the business. There could be threats. That's a threat to the organization. They're going to have to pay fines. They're going to have to disclose they had a breach. This is where we start to put on our thinking caps a little bit, because when people think of penetration testing, we don't really think of threat modeling. But this is one of the most important parts of penetration testing. We have to be able to show that what you found is going to be valuable, actionable, and usable to your client. Or if you're an internal pen tester for an organization, how is it going to be useful to that organization so it can improve and avoid liability? A good point to make right here is a penetration tester in general doesn't make an organization any money directly, unless it's a consulting company. But otherwise, it is a direct cost to that company. So the company needs to be able to justify that cost. And one of the ways we do that as security professionals is by using threat modeling to show what those threats could cost that company. And once we figure that out, we can make a better reason to why the company might spend money on cybersecurity in the first place. A good example to this is I worked with a company that was e-commerce, a large multi-billion-dollar company, and 1 hour of downtime for that company was equivalent at their peak to $130 million in revenue. You start to add that up. If they're down for just a few hours from a cyber attack, that is devastating to that company and that organization. All of a sudden, spending $50,000, even $500,000 on the right people, processes, and tools doesn't seem that expensive. Now, the next thing after we do some threat modeling is some additional vulnerability analysis. We want to understand what we have learned from our vulnerability scans or things that we've discovered through our recon. What is the impact of those specific vulnerabilities to these systems? Did we find that this is a low complexity attack vector that could be easily used by an adversary and can leak critical information? Now, there's a couple ways we can do this. We can use the CVSS version 3. We can use the OWASP top 10 or the bug crowd taxonomy if it's a web application. In general, we'll have a CVSS score. And as you can see, it's not a difficult graph to look at, but it can be a little complicated if you've never seen it before. Now, we're going to move into the exploitation phase now, and we've spent a good portion of our time so far in this live stream talking about a lot of other things before we get to this point. And I want to stress that exploitation is probably what most people think about when they think about hacking. Exploitation is pressing that red button and actually breaking in to the organization. Once we've done all the recon, this is the actual hacking part. And this is probably one of the smallest parts of the actual penetration testing process. I know that may be difficult to hear or understand, but that is just the reality of it. When you're doing a penetration testing engagement, oftentimes this is the shortest part of the whole engagement. So what do we do during the exploitation phase? Well, the first thing that we'll often do is we might do some phishing. We have to have an entry point. And over 70% of breaches occur due to a phishing email. That is just a reality. Most adversaries get into systems via phishing. That doesn't mean that there isn't other ways that bad guys get in. Because remember, there's still 30% of other things that bad guys can use to get into systems, whether it's via a USB drive, whether it's via a drive-by download. There's a couple different ways you can get in. But by and large, phishing is the number one way. Now, once you've established yourself inside an organization, now you're going to try and actively exploit all those vulnerabilities you've scanned. If someone gets in via this computer system, what can we exploit? Now, this is a good way to verify if vulnerabilities are accurate, because maybe our vulnerability scanner said that these machines had certain vulnerabilities, but maybe we have a really good antivirus that stops those vulnerabilities from being taken advantage of. Maybe we have a very good firewall that is stopping any of that to take place. I remember on a penetration test, when dealing with a certain firewall, when I tried to send traffic through that firewall, it would give my scanners and the tools I was using, I believe it was Nmap, a bunch of false positives. It would actually show up, it would trigger Nmap to say it had 800 Windows XP machines, when in reality, the firewall was just blocking the traffic. But if you just relied specifically on the tool, you might all of a sudden think, oh, there's 800 XP machines here. But that was just the way the firewall was set up to respond to those kind of attacks. And that's where some of these things can get a little nuanced. And sometimes going back to programming your own things in Python, sometimes you can't rely just on that. And then you have brute force attacks and password hacking. Almost every penetration testing engagement I've been on, except for a handful, I've almost always found password in some iteration attached to someone's user account on a system. And you can't make those things up, unfortunately. And it's not always password. It might be capital P with an @ sign, but it's some deviation of password. And in general, we need to encourage people to not use that and not do that and understand why that's just a bad idea. And then the last thing we can do in exploitation, which is honestly, in my experience, the most successful when we're conducting attacks, is performing man-in-the-middle attacks. Now, this tool that we're going to look at now is called the Social Engineering Toolkit. Now, this is a tool for automating and creating phishing emails with various attack vectors. Now, you can see it has modules for spear phishing, creating fake websites, copying a website. This was a tool created by TrustedSec. And they have a bunch of warnings on there about created by David Kennedy and TrustedSec. I want to make sure I correct that. There's a bunch of warnings on there about not using it for malicious purposes, but it's good to know that criminals don't care about warnings and they'll still use it for malicious purposes. And also that, in general, a lot of tools hackers use, or cyber criminals, I should say, use similar tools that will quickly allow you to customize different kinds of phishing attacks. In fact, some criminals have gotten so sophisticated that they sell these tools for $98 a week, supply the email addresses, and through a web interface, you can create your own phishing campaigns that are targeted with malware with a payment gateway. And you know things are getting pretty serious in the malware world when malware authors and cyber criminals are offering payment gateway to their customers. And this is often why I refer to cybercrime has become more of a business than anything else, because it's become commoditized. This is another reason why it's not a good idea to pay ransomware, to pay those organizations behind ransomware when they attack, if possible, because 2/3 of companies, or I'm not sure on the exact statistic, but a lot of companies are paying the ransom currently. We're funding these bad operations and rewarding the bad behavior of these organizations. Now, if we look here at our example for company X, Y, and Z, we can see that we have now hacked into what we'll call Bob's computer. So with Bob's computer hacked into, we can now begin to start looking at how we might start hacking some of the other computers, such as the accounting PC or any other critical system. So what are some of the different network exploitation tools that we have available to us? Well, this is a very small sampling. There's Metasploit. There is Nmap, as we talked about, can be used for hacking different things. Kali Linux is a operating system that just has a slew of hundreds of hacking tools written by various authors. Exploit Pack is another great tool specifically aimed at creating custom exploits and using novel exploits to get into certain systems. Armitage is a great GUI interface for Metasploit that makes it easy to hack into things. Ettercap is a man-in-the-middle tool that can be used for crafting very specific packets and taking advantage of very novel network penetration methods to get into systems and spy on traffic. Again, you can create tools in Python, Go, C++, PowerShell. In fact, a good portion of malware is written in PowerShell now. There is no end to the amount of network exploitation tools or just tools in general. It can be overwhelming looking at the vast landscape we have. So back in the day when we were talking about exploits, we started with this idea of a single exploit. And we had a single exploit that someone would create or program for a specific vulnerability. And that exploit would be tied to one payload. So if we made a piece of malware, we might write that malware, and that malware could only do one thing. That malware could take advantage of this one security flaw, and maybe the payload was to create a user account on that system or create some kind of a backdoor or install software on that system. But that wasn't very efficient because every single exploit had to be custom programmed. It made it very difficult on the defense side to test different kinds of exploits against various vulnerabilities and switch things out. Now, H.D. Moore saw that this was an issue and created the Metasploit framework, which is an open source exploitation framework. It allowed for separating exploits and payloads and allowed for easy development of custom exploits. So now if we have a vulnerability and we have an exploit that is taking advantage of that vulnerability, now we can have a separate payload. So maybe we want our payload to create a user account. Maybe we want that payload to install backdoor. Maybe we want the payload to send a message to someone saying, "Hi, I hacked into your system." There is a number of ways we can test this. And this can be essentially excellent on the blue team side. You might think this is only good for penetration testers or bad guys, but this can be very good when we're testing antivirus and defenses to see if it can catch different kinds of payloads. In fact, when I'm conducting penetration testing, sometimes it will catch trying to create a backdoor, but it might not catch if I create a new user account, or if I make some other slight modification or change that will allow access into the system. This makes it much easier, again, hence the point why it was made, to develop these exploits and test them. So now we're going to see example the entire way through. How would we use Nmap and hack into a system using Metasploit? So the first thing we're going to do, and we're using Metasploitable 2 for this example, is we're first going to scan Metasploitable 2. And the first thing we're going to do is look to see if there are any vulnerable services that might be running on the system. Now, if we scroll up a little bit, what we will find is VS FTPD 2.3.4 running on this system. Now, there is an exploit in Metasploit for this. In the Metasploit framework, we just type search and we look for the specific software version, and we can see on the bottom there's a backdoor exploit for that version of VS FTPD. Now, in Metasploit, if we want to use an exploit, we simply type use and the path to an exploit, because Metasploit is file-based. Once we are in, we can show the different options for Metasploit. Now, the options for this that it requires we put in is the remote host. So we need to put in the IP address of the system we're attacking. So in this case, we set the R host for what we're attacking. We check the options again with show options to make sure it's running properly. And we can run exploit. And as we can see, it found a shell or a remote shell. Now, what a shell is that gives us access into that system. Now, if we run who am I, we can see we are now root on the Linux system we hacked into. And I know what you're saying. Is it really that easy? Well, no, because most of the time when you run exploits, they don't work. In fact, 90% of the time, I'd say, when you're running an exploit, especially from Metasploit, an antivirus, IPS, IDS, something normally kicks in place that stops it from working. But oftentimes, if it's an IoT device, if it's a camera, if it's something that might be a bit more obscure, it's fairly easy to take advantage of it and see that it does actually work. Now let's look at another example. Maybe we want to create our own exploit or our own .exe. We can do that via Metasploit and create our own payloads that we can then use. In this example, this is going to be our victim Bob again, and we're going to have Bob go and download our .exe we created, which is Windows Metinterpreter Stage Reverse TCP 443.exe. And he's going to go ahead and save that and run that because someone told Bob that, if he runs this exploit, he'll get, 1,000 Bitcoin. And Bob doesn't want to miss out on his, 1,000 Bitcoin opportunity here. So he's going to run this program. And Windows is going to tell him in many cases that this is a bad program you shouldn't run. But like most people, Bob's going to hit run anyway. Now it's going to spin for a little bit, and then to the observer, it doesn't look like anything happens. Now, some of us are used to this idea that when malware runs on a system, all of a sudden lots of lights come up and it says you have ransomware and whatnot, but it doesn't have to do that. And oftentimes the cyber criminals who are very technical don't want you to be there. In fact, when the NSA and Russia, when they hack into things, they're nigh invisible, and that's the idea. So in this case, if we're looking on our backend system on Metinterpreter, which is the built-in post-exploitation framework in Metasploit, we can see we now have access to this computer system. Now, we haven't done anything to this computer system yet, but we can start to interact with it. So if we run the dir command, which is a Windows command, we can see the desktop of the user. And we can also run ls, and it will show us the same thing. Another thing we can do is we can run edit, which will run a Vim-style editing interface that will allow us to modify files. So maybe we want to write Bob a note, and in this case, we're going to let Bob know that he's been hacked and he needs to pay some ransom money. And if we do that and then save, we can actually see there's the note we just wrote on his desktop. And it's really that easy. That is pretty much the process. You scan a system, you find some type of vulnerability, or you somehow get access to a system via phishing. And then once you have access to that system, you then run your own software on that system once you have access. That doesn't matter if it's Windows, if it's Linux, if it's your Android phone, if it's your iPhone, whatever it might be. I mean, those are the steps. Now, there's a lot of things that get in the way of those steps, such as antivirus and firewalls and different defensive techniques. But a lot of the time, criminals, as the more barriers we as defenders put in front, figure out creative ways to bypass those barriers. So here's another example. If you aren't familiar with the command line, or you just don't like using the command line, you can also use Armitage, which is a Metasploit graphical user interface. Now you can see right there, we're going to right click and we're going to run, and it's running an Nmap ping scan. We can right click and run some other kinds of scans and attacks. We can even run what we call a Hail Mary attack, which will literally run every single Metasploit attack at the target. Now, I don't recommend this because A, it's kind of, sloppy and unorganized and not really great. And B, it can crash systems or create other issues by trying to run a bunch of exploits against a system that probably shouldn't work. Now we can see right here, this is checking a bunch of exploits to see if it's vulnerable. And now we're going to just run that Hail Mary attack. And I think it'll even tell us that it tells us there in the pop-up that it's clumsy and dumb. But if you want to do it, you can. And in this case, it will, and I'll skip past some of this, it will gather all those payloads, and it takes a while because Metasploit has a lot of payloads, and you can see it's launching all these different kinds of attacks. It's just trying every single one, even though it has no idea if any of them will work. It's just going to launch every single one because that's what it's designed to do. And again, I don't necessarily recommend this. You can try it if you're trying to understand how stable your system is and maybe seeing how an AV you have might block different things. But in general, running a Hail Mary attack isn't very valuable. But from an academic perspective, it's pretty interesting. Now we can see that one of the things we did worked because we get the nice gooey red lightning. And if we hit the interact, we get the same thing we had before. We can say, who am I? And we can see we now have access to that computer system. So now let's talk about man-in-the-middle attacks. Man-in-the-middle attacks are far more sophisticated attacks. They're very easy to mess up, so to speak. Someone in the comments said about running a Hail Mary attack that it's very noisy. It absolutely is extremely noisy. It's not very impressive, and it will likely be caught. A good example, though, is if your defenses in place don't catch a Hail Mary attack, that's a problem because it's creating and generating so much traffic that it should. Now, man-in-the-middle attacks, as I was saying, the idea here is we're intercepting network traffic. Now, traffic normally goes from one computer to another, and networks tend to be pretty chatty. When your computer is looking for something, it may even send out a request saying, hey, does anyone know where I can get to this computer? I'm not quite sure where I need to go. Can someone direct me? And what we can do when we're poisoning network traffic is we can pretend to be legitimate services like the DNS server that figures out where everything is on the network, what everything's named. We can spin up as a bad guy, a bad DNS server. We can intercept traffic and pretend to be other devices. We can get pretty crafty in this. Now, the thing to keep in mind with man-in-the-middle attacks is man-in-the-middle attacks can cause downtime on a system. You have to be very careful in your rules of engagement to specify that you want to use man-in-the-middle attacks. Otherwise, you can potentially cause quite a bit of downtime. And I know some people might say, well, I am hacker elite, so I'm going to use man-in-the-middle attacks. Please don't do that, because mistakes happen. Make sure you have it in writing that you're going to attempt man-in-the-middle attacks, and the client understands that this could cause some disruption, because if you don't, and you do cause a lot of disruption, it can create a lot of havoc. Now, the key thing here is once we poison the traffic, we want to spy on that traffic. We want to look for, maybe we can get credentials in plain text. Maybe we can steal some credentials. Or maybe we can redirect traffic and pretend to be someone we've hacked into. So one of the tools we're going to talk about is a tool that I use pretty often on a lot of my penetration testing engagements, and it tends to work far more than it probably should, is Responder. Now, this tool is a tool for poisoning a bunch of different things. It can poison DNS, it can poison LLMNR. Mainly, I tend to use it for poisoning LLMNR and intercepting and relaying credentials. Now, how we do that here, Responder is a tool written in Python and it's built into Kali Linux. So we have to specify our interface and specify some command line switches we want to run. And we can see the poisoners. We're poisoning LLMNR, we're poisoning NBT. And how this works, if you had a file share, and in our case, we're using the test share, use test share. Now, if you were to click on like the D drive or an E drive that you have in your company, you would have to log into it. So we can see that we're trying to use test.share and we're attempting to log into it. But what we don't see on the back end is we've actually poisoned that traffic. So what we've done is we've either taken that share offline via a type of DDoS attack, or we've overwhelmed it so it's no longer available. And we are now pretending to be that server. So when they attempt to go to that share, we get in front of the traffic and we say, when that computer says, hey, I'm looking for test/share, we say, oh, we're test.share. Please connect to us and give us your credentials. And what happens is we get these signed challenge credentials that we can then go back and use and attempt to crack. Now, that's one thing we can do with these credentials. As I said before, we can also potentially do what's known as a relay attack, in which maybe we send these credentials to a different server and we pretend to be the user that was originally trying to access the server, because we can't see what their credentials are yet. We still would have to break them via a password cracking, and depending on the password, that might not be feasible on the length of the pen test. Now, once we've hacked into a system, you might think, well, we're done. We hacked into a system. There's nothing else to do. And that, unfortunately, could not be further than the truth. The next phase we move into is what we call the post-exploitation phase, because bad guys get access to systems all the time. And when they do, we go into damage mode or response mode. We want to stop them from getting to other systems and living in those systems. Post-exploitation is figuring out what you can do on systems after you've gotten access to them. So some of our goals when we're doing post-exploitation, the first thing we want to do is establish persistence. And what do I mean by persistence? Well, most pieces of malware that you'll see live in RAM or memory. And what happens in RAM and memory is that it's temporary. When you turn off your computer system, the malware will go away because it's not actually installed on your system. So we need to establish some way to persist. Now, the other thing we want to do is elevate our privileges. Maybe Bob is not the user we want. We want to be able to elevate to a user that has access to the accounting database, and maybe Bob doesn't have access to that. We also want to perform some lateral movement between devices. Maybe we're not getting where we want to be on Bob's computer, but we bet if we can get over to the accounting computer, we could find some information that'd be valuable. And then once we've done that, we want to gather what we might call loot, as it's called in Metasploit, or anything that may be critical or sensitive to the organization within your rules of engagement. You might have a rule of engagement that says certain information you're not allowed to touch. And even though a cyber criminal would be allowed to touch it, you're bound under your contract. You don't want to break anything in there. So you want to be careful with the information you gather and only gather what you're allowed to as part of your penetration tests. In some cases, it might be very specific things that you're supposed to gather. Maybe it's only passwords or only specific usernames and accounts and certain information. So how do we establish persistence? Well, we might create a brand new user account. Oftentimes I've created the account Brandon Keith and seen if anyone noticed that I created my own account there. I make sure I have permission before doing this, but that's a common thing I do. I might create a software service on the system. This can be a little messier because if you create a service, you want to make sure after you're done with your penetration test that you delete it. There is nothing worse than performing a penetration test and then leaving a back door open for a malicious cyber criminal to come in and take over an organization. You don't want that liability, and you don't want to be the person that causes an organization to have a breach. So you want to be careful if you create a software service. And you could also create a scheduled task, and maybe that scheduled task inside it, you put code that's going to allow you to get access to a system. All these are valid ways to establish persistence. There's also other ways to do it, but these are pretty common ways to establish persistence. And maybe you just live in RAM and the hope is that that computer doesn't restart, and that might be acceptable for an engagement. There are some servers that only go down when they need to install Windows updates, and you can persist in RAM for a pretty long time when a computer doesn't shut down. Now, what are some of the post-exploitation tools you can use? Well, we looked at Metinterpreter a little bit earlier, and the idea behind post-exploitation tools is they allow you to do things after you've exploited a computer, such as gather credentials, attempt to find credit card numbers, attempt to find social security numbers, or any valuable information that might be on a computer system. Now, Metinterpreter is a popular one, but I will tell you from my experience, it is very rare in an actual engagement that Metinterpreter works for me as part of the engagement. It just is too well known by antivirus vendors, and it just gets picked up very easily. In what I prefer to use is a tool called Nmap Exec. Now, this was written by Marcelo, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, but he is an incredible penetration tester and programmer. He makes a lot of amazing tools. He has videos about the tools he's made. If you've never seen any of his videos, Google him, check him out. He does a lot of really amazing things for the community, and I can't give enough support for Marcelo. But he created this tool, Nmap Exec, and it's a post-exploitation tool that takes a couple other tools together and creates a framework for pen testing large environments. And it was designed to be geared towards Active Directory and be a glue between multiple frameworks. There's a lot of different exploitation frameworks. Metasploit isn't the only one. There's PowerShell Empire, which is now back in support. There is other tools as well. Can't think of some of the names right now, but there is a laundry list, and some of them aren't very easy to pronounce, of different tools. Nmap Exec makes it pretty easy to do it, and it uses this idea of living off the land. And by living off the land, Nmap Exec often does not get tagged by antivirus. So you can often get in and take information from systems without having to worry about antivirus in many cases. So how does Nmap Exec work? Well, here's a great example, and this is an account where we've gotten a password somehow, and we have the username. This is super admin, and this is their password on the space.local domain. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Nmap Exec to log into the system and try and dump all of the usernames and the SAM, which contains all of the usernames and hash passwords. Now you can see it actually worked. We got this little yellow pwned symbol up there, and the idea behind that is it lets us know that we've gained administrative access to the system. So by having the little yellow pwned sign, we know that we have a local administrator on that system. Now, in general, once we have that, we can then dump the usernames and passwords. We can dump something called the LSA secrets, which is going to have catch usernames and credentials that can allow us to log into other computer systems. Now, to make matters worse, we don't necessarily need the password to do this either. We can also log in with just the hash. If we got the correct hash, we can use a pass the hash attack to log in and steal credentials from a computer system. As you can see, that makes this tool pretty scary in the different things we can do. We can also enumerate shares and perform a lot of other potentially dangerous actions using this tool. It's very powerful. Now, to recap and give an idea, and I think that sometimes there's a lot of confusion on this. When we talk about malware, what we're really talking about is just malicious software. To a computer, it can't tell the difference between if something is malware or if something is just regular software. This is why antivirus is so important when we're talking about cybersecurity. And still today, I know a lot of people that don't run antivirus on their Macs, They might not run antivirus on their phones, and they might not even run antivirus on Windows. It's incredibly important to do this because that is the only way your computer is going to be able to determine what's a good piece of software and what's a malicious piece of software. Now, here's two examples of what we call reverse shells. The first one is written in Bash, and the second one is written in PowerShell. Now, that is a little misleading because the second one in PowerShell, the virus.ps1, is a PowerShell file that's quite a bit longer and wouldn't entirely fit on this slide. But I wanted to give the idea and show that when you're hacking into a system, it's not as much black magic as often people would make it appear. This is simply software that's written in a malicious way, and it works just like any other software. Now, when we talk about what is a shell, if you have never heard of this concept of a shell, or you're scratching your head and going, what is this shell? I'm not quite sure I understand what a shell is. A shell is just a way of interacting with your computer system. It has nothing to do with turtles at all, for anyone who's wondering if it does. It's the thing we interact with when we turn on a Windows PC, that's called a graphical user interface or a graphical shell. Now, when we're talking about a command line interface, that is a command line shell. So when you hear the term reverse shell, it just means a way to interact with your computer system. It seems like a really complicated term, and you'll often hear hackers saying they got a shell, or they were able to shell that computer, and it gets a little confusing if you're not quite sure what the term means. But that's essentially what it is. It's just a way to interact with your computer system. And a reverse shell means that you now have access to interact with that person's computer system and potentially have a high administrative access. So what's another way that we can potentially get into a system? Maybe crap-mapped exec isn't working, or maybe we need to log in to a system. Well, what we can do using xfree RDP is, if we were able to get the hash, maybe we don't have the password, we can actually use remote desktop to get into the system. And what that will allow us to do is log in as if we were that user. And then we could do something potentially like run a share on a computer system. And then we can use that to access something like Mimikatz. In this case, the example I have here is called Safety Cats. And what Safety Cats allows you to do is actually dump all the usernames and passwords in RAM. Now, RAM is normally what people think about when they want their computer to go faster. But the idea of RAM is that it's what you're doing at the time. Everything you're doing in your computer, when you load it up, everything gets loaded from your hard drive, which you can almost think of like a filing cabinet, to your desk or your RAM. RAM is what you're doing. And one of the things that gets stored in RAM is when people connect to a computer system, when you connect to a file share like File Share E or the D drive or some separate share somewhere, Windows actually tries to help you by catching your credentials for that share. And it will catch your credentials in memory while you're logged into that computer. Now, what ends up happening, because some computer systems, especially servers, aren't restarted for months at a time, the credentials in there build up. So you can run these tools like Safety Cats or Mimikatz that will dump all the credentials that exist in memory. I've done penetration tests where we were able to get to this and dump credentials, and we would get hundreds of people's credentials because they had all logged into the system. This is another reason why sometimes it's important to restart your computer, because you might not know what's living in your computer's RAM or memory. Now, another tool you can use once you have access to those hashes is Hashcat. And Hashcat is used for cracking passwords. It can quickly crack common passwords. Here's an example of the usage. We're not going to go through a video example because Hashcat is a pretty complicated piece of software, and we could literally spend hours discussing how to use Hashcat, the right ways to use Hashcat, and what it means. Now, another tool I want to make sure we cover is Bloodhound. Bloodhound is one of my favorite tools, and I discovered Bloodhound a couple of years ago. I can't exactly remember the first time I discovered it, but a group of hackers got this idea that, well, wouldn't it be great if there was a way, once you hack into a system, to figure out, based off Active Directory, because it contains all that information, where everything is. And that's exactly what Bloodhound does. Because almost every environment uses Active Directory. It takes advantage of those Active Directory objects to start to run queries, or it essentially what it does is it asks the computer system, hey, do you have any information on computer A? I'd really like to get some information on it. And amazingly, this works. The computer responds and will say, depending on your privilege level, of course, depending, maybe Bob doesn't have as much access as Mary the accountant, but it might give Bob a lot of information about where Mary's computer is. And another thing you can get from Bloodhound is you can actually find out who is logged into each system. Now, why is that important? Well, remember, we just talked about Mimikatz and dumping credentials. If we know who has higher privileges and we know where those credentials exist, we can then chart a path and create an attack plan of how we get access to those valuable targets and credentials. Perhaps the best way to look at it is to look at the map it creates. And one of the maps it creates, if we look here, we can see that there's a bunch of different relationships between the different devices. And if we look up near the top, we can see the little skull icon is the member or the user account I have infected. And we can see that that has access to this domain, and it's a member of the domain admins. So the account I have access to is already a member of the domain admins. What that means is, if you're a domain admin, it means you have the functions of administrator across the entire company domain or network. You can run any of those commands and it will not stop you. Now, if we didn't have access to this account, if we had a lower privilege account, Bloodhound can actually give us an example or a path to how we might get to that account. Now, Bloodhound is one of the tools that I consider almost better used by blue team members, or should be used by every blue team member, because often knowing where your users are logged into and what systems are logged into and who has access to what is extremely valuable information. And one of the things we do when we perform a pen test is we go back, if we were able to use Bloodhound successfully, if it did not get stopped, we tend to walk through with systems administrators exactly how they got hacked and how potentially looking at your Active Directory can help protect your systems from further compromise. It's a fantastic tool. We're going to walk through a quick example of some of the things you can look up in Bloodhound, and we can simply go by, we can see the database we have, it's a local database, but there's some pre-built in analytics functions. One of the things we can do is we can look for all the domain admins, and we can also look for the shortest path to domain admins. Now, as you can see here, this is our graph that is going to show us what are all the systems we need to compromise to get to that domain admin. Now, in pen testing for a long time, the idea was that if you could get a domain admin account, that you've basically proved there was nothing more in your post-exploitation phase you could hack. Now, while that's changed a little bit in recent years, it still holds true for a lot of penetration tests. And this tends to be one of the things that is targeted during penetration tests. Now, some of the other analytics it has is shortest path to high-value targets. Now, we can see that this graph starts to get a little unwieldy to look at depending on how much information we put in it. And that's one thing to be careful of when I've been on pen testing engagements where we've been actually able to successfully run Bloodhound on several thousand computers. The data, the vast amount of data can get a little confusing and can be difficult. And it may require you to run your own custom queries, which you can do in Bloodhound. But this is a great tool. If you're not familiar with it, I definitely recommend getting familiar with it, regardless of what you're planning to do in cybersecurity. Now, at this point, because of the things we've hacked into in our example, we've gotten to the accounting PC. We were able to use Bloodhound and some of those other tools to get into the servers and to the accounting PC. And this is how an organization gets compromised. And then sometimes the cyber criminals are able to exist within the organization without being discovered for months and sometimes years. I think the most egregious case that I was privy to was over 10 years, a MacBook computer was hacked into because they had no antivirus and no way of detecting that someone had access to their system until they eventually installed some type of antivirus and discovered that they had been hacked into. So reporting. Now, this is one of the critical parts of penetration testing that often gets ignored. We think about all the fun stuff like hacking into devices and pivoting with Bloodhound and using some of these novel and interesting ways to break into systems. But over 50% of the penetration test is in the reporting and presentation. And I know that can be difficult to hear and difficult to comprehend, but good writing and public speaking skills are excellent ways to become a good penetration tester. And I know that sounds a little weird, but it's imperative when you're talking to business owners or you're talking to people that don't understand what you're doing. They're not going to understand what a reverse shell is or what Metasploit is or what crazy hacking exploit you use to break into a system. This is, again, going back to when we talked about threat modeling and vulnerability analysis. We need to break that down in a way that our audience, which is often CEOs and executives and CFOs, can understand the risk that their environment is facing. Hence why good reporting is important. And unfortunately, in our field, there's a lot of penetration testers with bad reporting and bad presentation skills. If you want to be a consultant in penetration testing or running your own company, one of the things you can focus on, definitely focus on your hacking skills. Make sure your technical prowess is up to date, but don't neglect your presentation skills and your writing skills because they will almost be just as important. When a client pays $50,000 for a penetration test, that report, those 20, 50, 100 pages better look like they're worth $50,000, because if they're not, good chances are that company isn't going to hire your company to do a pen test again. Now, there's a lot of great tips we can do when we're talking about reporting. You want to make sure that your penetration testing report is concise and has clear information, especially in the executive summary. Try to exclude as much jargon as possible. If you're doing bug bounties, it's almost become a requirement to include a short explanational video of your proof of concept of the exploit. Many companies that run bug bounty programs, they absolutely want to pay freelance hackers for helping solve their security issues. But if you can't explain the vulnerability in a way that they can understand, they're not going to be able to pay you for your finding if they can't understand it. You want to give an explanation of the impacts of the vulnerabilities to an organization in a way they understand. You don't want to just say, well, we were able to get into Active Directory, and because of that, we were able to pivot from this machine to that machine. No, we want to talk about how we were able to take advantage of Greg's account, and we were able to get access to any information Greg was able to get access to. And because of that, we were able to get all of the financial information of the company, and that's the vulnerability. Someone could get all your financial information, or maybe for the company it was all the trade secrets of the company. We have to put it in terms that people, those executives, are going to understand and care about. Now, this is also why I tend to recommend you have two final presentations. You have a presentation with executives, but you also want to have a presentation just with the IT staff. So if the IT staff wants to dive into more of the technical areas of the penetration test and what you did, that should be fine. But if you have them both in the same room, the CEO is not only going to be bored, but his mind is going to be blown and he's not going to understand, and he's going to become very disinterested very quickly when you're using words and jargon he doesn't understand. Now, there's a lot of different example reports out there, and reports can be shorter and longer depending on the engagement. A good factor to look at is most penetration tests cost an average about $33,000 per engagement. Now, bug bounties focus on one particular flaw or error, often in web applications, but they can be in other applications that someone may have hacked into. Now, a good example of a report is Offensive Security's sample penetration test report. I'm having some feedback there. Apologize for that. All right, and now we're going to take a couple minutes to talk about web application penetration testing. When we're talking about web application penetration testing, the methodology is a bit more complicated than PTES. Now, why do we have to have a different methodology for hacking web applications? Well, we didn't always need a different methodology, but now web applications have become pretty complicated. This is an example of the web app hacking methodology from the Web App Hacking Handbook. Now, the reason why this is a great methodology to use is because it's very thorough, but it can be pretty complicated when you're first looking at it. And it starts with mapping the application, analyzing it for flaws, testing client-side controls, testing access controls, testing for logic flaws, testing the authentication mechanism, testing session management, and then testing for web server vulnerabilities. So that's a slew of things that you need to test for each web application, and there's a lot of levels beyond each of those for testing. Now, there's a lot of interesting tools you can use when you're testing web applications. One of my favorite tools is Wapalyzer, which you can download for Chrome or Firefox, and it will, on any website you visit, show you all of the services and software that website might be using. For example, in my demonstration, you can see I'm using MySQL, I'm using WordPress, and I'm using PHP for my personal website. Now, this can be very helpful when you're doing bug bounties and you're looking at websites, or if you're just trying to get some initial reconnaissance on what technologies a website might be running. Now, to give an example of how you might hack in using a SQL vulnerability injection, now there's a lot of different attacks you can use, but for this example, we're going to try and log in as Alice. And then we're going to add a apostrophe and then the £. And we'll notice here that it then allowed us to log in. And the reason it did that is because this application is written in PHP. Now, when we escaped using our apostrophe for the name Alice, and we then used the £, what that £, did in PHP was actually comment out the rest of the code. So as far as the computer system is concerned, remember, computers are dumb. They're only doing what they're told and what they're programmed to do. So when it looked at the programming originally said, all right, if login and password, if login equals this and password equals this, log in. But since we commented out that password part, the computer looked at it and said, oh, if login equals Alice, log in. And it allowed us to log in. And that's how SQL injection, at least at a very basic fundamental level, works. We're injecting code into areas that aren't sanitized properly. And that's how we begin to see different areas of how we can take advantage of web application. Now, that is just one example. And we're not going to cover web applications a lot tonight, but just give an idea of some of the tools. Now, one of the tools is Skipfish. Skipfish is a great web application security scanner, very high speed. It can detect a lot of different web applications. I do warn people that want to use Skipfish is that it can cause downtime and even perform almost like a DDoS attack against the system. So be very wary if you're going to use Skipfish on a client website. I've run into this before trying to run Skipfish on different sites where it brings things down. Now we can see we've just been running Skipfish for a couple seconds and we're up to over, it might be hard to see, but we're up to over 8,000 requests and building. And this is one of the benefits of Skipfish, but it's also one of its downsides because it is constantly creating more issues. Now, another tool we can look at is Nikto. And Nikto is great for looking at server misconfigurations. There might be some misconfigurations we have. Nikto is a great way for us to look at them and try and figure out a way to resolve those issues. Now, Nikto is pretty easy to use. We just need to type Nikto and then -H and then what our IP address of the target we're trying to break into. And once we run Nikto, it'll go through and just start to gather lots of information. Now, we can see that the first thing it tells us is that the anti-clickjacking header isn't present and that the cross-site scripting protection header is not defined. And we can see that it came back, and again, on my website, that this is running WordPress. Nikto can give us some interesting configuration issues, and sometimes it might be things that we might overlook otherwise. Another great tool, although I haven't seen it used a lot recently, is Arachne, and this tool provides a very nice web application interface for running automated web application scans. And at one point, it boasted a very high accuracy rate. Some of those statistics are rather old. I'm not sure how often it's used anymore, but if you're looking for something with a good web UI that's going to give you a very pretty report, Arachne might be a great issue for you. Not a great issue, a great tool for you to use. Now, OWASP Zap is a man-in-the-middle proxy that you can use for web app hacking. It's a great tool, but it's fallen out of favor for things like Burp Suite and Burp Suite Pro, which is considered far more powerful. Now, Burp Suite Pro is arguably the industry standard for web application hacking. It's extensible with Python and Java plugins, but for the professional version, it costs about $400 for a commercial license. If you're serious about web app penetration testing, though, Burp Suite Pro is probably going to be an expense you'll have to deal with in your career at some point, unless you're working for a company that has already purchased the tool. All right, and diving into cybersecurity, we finally got to the end where we will discuss how we want to, how would you get in or break into cybersecurity? If you're looking to get into cybersecurity, there's a couple things to consider. I often get a lot of questions. Do I need a degree? Do I need a cert? Do I need experience? How much experience do I need? Where do I get that experience? And unfortunately, the answer to this is it depends. Some companies are going to require specific degrees, like a cybersecurity degree or a degree in IT. Some companies are going to be very specific about the certs they want. I know on certain penetration testing engagements, even though members of my team had a very specific, had pen testing certs already, they specifically wanted to see EC Council's Certified Ethical Hacker. That was a cert that was on their list. And we could not conduct the engagement unless we had those specific certs. Now, I think a lot of people will argue the benefits of the CEH, EC Council CEH versus CompTIA's Pen Test Plus versus Offensive Security OSCP, or maybe even eLearn Security's Penetration Testing Professional. But when it comes down to it at the end of the day, penetration testing is a pretty competitive field. It's by far probably the smallest percent of cybersecurity professionals, and it can be kind of a niche field to get into. If it's something you're serious about, you're likely going to get all of the above or as many penetration testing certs as you can get. And the reason you'd want to do that is because if it happens to be on an HR checklist or a specific project, you want to make sure that you have the cert that's required for that project. When it comes to degrees, I've seen this a lot less, but it depends on the organization. Some organizations are just very strict about that. They do require a bachelor's degree. Oftentimes, though, even when they say they require it, there's normally, if you word things correctly, you can normally negotiate on what they're truly looking for. When it comes to experience, people often ask me, how do you get experience in the field without working in the field? Many companies will say, we're looking for an entry-level cybersecurity person, but that entry-level person needs 1 to 3 years experience. And I understand the circular reasoning. How can you get experience if you can never get a job in the first place? Unfortunately, the only true answer to this is you have to work either an unpaid internship or a low-paid internship, or work on some open source or community-based cybersecurity projects. It truly is just the only way to get experience. One thing you can do is you can work in a home lab and document what you're doing. Maybe create a blog or create videos that document your journey via penetration testing. That's one way to gain experience and show that you've gained experience doing that. Another is to see if there's local companies around you, especially nonprofits, and tell them that you're trying to get experience in this area and you'd be willing to volunteer your time to help. One thing to understand when you're talking about cybersecurity, you're talking about protecting a company's main assets. And the reason why there aren't a lot of entry-level cybersecurity positions is almost the same way if you were hiring a bodyguard to protect your life. Would you want to hire a bodyguard where it is their first day on a job and they've never saved anyone before? Or would you want to hire an experienced bodyguard that is more likely to be able to protect your assets and your business? More than likely, you're going to want to hire the security guard with more experience. The same is true about cybersecurity. Oftentimes, companies want the best they can get. Unfortunately, there isn't enough of the best to go around. There's just not that many people in the field to meet the demand, especially at the high caliber a lot of these companies are demanding. And this is why you kind of see a bit of an inflation in some of the cybersecurity salaries, because where there is high demand and low supply, you see salaries tend to rise. Now, another thing that I mentioned to people, especially when you're trying to get into cybersecurity, is networking is essential. If you're trying to break into cybersecurity, I definitely recommend networking as much as you possibly can via community events. Even though we're currently in a lockdown, we have a pandemic right now in 2020, there's still a lot of virtual events you can attend. And after this is over, I encourage people to go out to B-sides and local cybersecurity events to learn and grow with other professionals. And by making those connections, just by making those connections in and of itself, you'll likely find a job. And most of all, in this field, like any other field, it requires a lot of study and practice. If you want to get good at this field, you need to study a lot and you need to practice a lot with hands-on material. If you are not constantly practicing and learning new things, you will be left behind. It's unfortunate, but it is the reality of how this field works. Things are changing every day, and you have to be okay with knowing that that obscure thing you studied last year might be out of date tomorrow or even 3 months from now, or maybe even that exploit or tool you used a couple days ago may no longer work a couple days from now. That is unfortunately just the reality of this field. But it's also what makes this field interesting. You're always learning new things. There's always new things to practice. I can assure you it's very difficult to get bored in this field. If you're bored, you're likely doing something wrong, or maybe you don't truly care or like the field to begin with. This is not a field to go into if you're just looking for a lot of money. I think right now people would tell you if you wanted to make money right now, one of the best ways is probably via the stock market. There's some companies that are very likely to go up right now. If you find this field interesting and you want to have a good, potentially high-paying career and make an impact on community and society as a whole by working in cybersecurity and protecting organizations from cyber criminals, then please join this field because we need more good people. Goodness knows we have plenty of bad people in this field. Now, I touched on this a little bit. There's a lot of different cybersecurity certifications. Bar none, my favorite certifications is the eLearn Securities PTS and PTP certifications. They are by far some of the most interesting and intricate certifications I've taken and been involved in. And it's just a very good mix of hands-on and theory that they put in their certs. And I definitely recommend them. The Offensive Security certification, I haven't taken that certification yet. And it's recently just changed, but that is the de facto standard. If you want to stand out as a penetration tester, this is almost a must for members of a penetration team to have the OSCP. Now, the CompTIA Pentest Plus, I've taken this certification, and it's fairly interesting. I would grade it higher than EC Council's Certified Ethical Hacker in some ways because they're just different in what they test on. CompTIA Pentest Plus tests much higher in programming to the point where Pentest Plus almost requires that you know quite a bit more programming than EC Council's Certified Ethical Hacker. But the Pentest Plus doesn't ask quite as many specific tool questions that EC Council's Certified Ethical Hacker tests will quiz you on, where EC Council's will ask very pointed questions about very specific tools and situations that the CompTIA Pentest Plus might not. Regardless, as I said before, if you're serious about getting into this field and doing penetration testing, you'll likely potentially get several of these certifications, if not all of them at one point, because an employer may require it. So let the training begin. There's a lot of different tools you can use for training. Some of the ones I used in this presentation were the OWASP broken web apps, which contains several different broken web apps. You can test your web application penetration testing skills. Metasploitable 2. You can use VirtualBox for running a lot of different machines. There's the Web Security Dojo. I highly recommend, if you haven't done already, download Kali Linux and take a look at how that system works and learn how to use it. Now, another great resource is Hacksplaining, which is a great resource for learning how web hacking works. So here's an example of the OWASP broken web apps. These are all the different web apps that exist in the OWASP broken web apps ISO or virtual machine you can download. And here's a couple different capture the flag websites you can look at that will let you practice your skills in an ethical manner. Hack the Box is definitely probably the most popular right now and one that many people are using today. Now, there are some other paid resources that are very good. One of my favorites actually is currently Pentester Academy, has a lot of great resources for practicing your penetration testing skills, and it's fairly low priced. I definitely have a subscription to that, and I've been enjoying that. Hack the Box is another one that's pretty essential if you're looking to do more with penetration testing. So in sum, tonight we covered what is a hacker. We covered some parts of network penetration testing. We talked about web application penetration testing. We talked about how you might break into a career in cybersecurity, specifically penetration testing. Now, if you liked this live stream and you want to see more, please let me know. Follow me on Twitter, Tweet me, let me know what other kind of courses you want to see or information you'd like to see from me, and I'll see if I can put together a live stream on it. The other thing I do is visit pahackers.com. It's a local hacking group in Central PA. We have events pretty much every month. Most of our events are now virtuals. If you don't live in Central PA, you can now attend them. And you can see some of our past presentations on github.com/pahackers/presentations. I did want to give a shout out to eLearn Security. Their courses are so great, and right now they're offering the penetration testing student. You can get the bare bones version of the course for free by signing up for ethicalhacker.net. Now, they don't pay me or give me anything for saying this. I just honestly think it's some great content, and if you're interested in getting into penetration testing, it's definitely an essential course to take. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being part of the stream. I know we had some issues in the beginning of the stream. There's been quite a few issues over the past few days with some of the streaming software, simply because there's been such a load on Facebook and YouTube and the streaming servers. Thank you for bearing with me through the technical issues, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. See you again soon.